Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome to today's Civic Life Lunch, the Salem Witch Trials, Hauntings from Our Civic Past, and the first event of the fall 2021 semester. My name is Nithya Prakash, and I'm a second-year master's student with the Tufts Department of History, studying ancient world and religious history with a focus on cognitive and sensory historical analysis. In my very first semester here at Tufts, I shared a research seminar with Rachel Christ, who will be speaking today, and had the privilege to peer edit her essay on the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials. And today I have the pleasure of kicking things off for this event and introducing our two speakers and moderator. Before we get started there, we would just like to express how grateful we are for the support of our wonderful co-sponsors today, including the History Department, the Center for Humanities at Tufts, the Women's Center, and the Civic Studies program. Thanks to them and plenty of other people, Tisch College has put together a great lineup of events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually this fall. On Wednesday, September 22nd, we will host assistant coach of the NBA's Memphis Grizzlies and Tufts alumna Sonia Rahman as part of the Tisch College Solomon Speaker Series. Later this semester, we will be thrilled to welcome Pulitzer Prize winning author Isabel Wilkerson, former two-term Republican Governor of Ohio John Kasich, Senator Tammy Duckworth, and many more. You can find more information and register for all our opportunities by visiting tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. Just a quick note for folks in the Zoom room today, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions during the event. If you do have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time. Tisch staff will be in touch with you directly for additional instructions, and they will do their best to get to as many of your questions as possible. Now, it is my great pleasure to give a short introduction for our speakers today, Rachel Christ, Marilynne K. Roach, and Alicia Rankin. Rachel Christ is the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum, as well as a Tufts alumna. She began working at the Salem Witch Museum in 2015 and has been the Director of Education since 2017. Within her role at the museum, Christ works with students and teachers, curates the museum's exhibits, directs staff training, and coordinates the museum's educational programming. She holds a bachelor's in global history from Clark University and a master's in history and museum studies from Tufts University. As a last note, on behalf of the entire Tufts community, we would like to congratulate Rachel on her recent marriage and wish her nothing but happiness in the future. Marilynne K. Roach will be joining Rachel in conversation as an author, illustrator, and researcher. Roach has written for the Boston Globe, the New England Historic Genealogical Register, and the Lizzie Borden Quarterly. She has authored 7 children's books and 2 adult books, including Six Women of Salem, the Untold Story of the Accused and Their Accusers in the Salem Witch Trials. Roach is also a member of the Gallows Hill Project that verified the correct site of the 1692 hangings, a discovery listed in Archaeology Magazine's list of the world's 10 most important discoveries of 2017. Finally, our moderator this afternoon is Alicia Rankin, an associate professor of history at Tufts, who has been teaching with the Department of History for 13 years. Her work focuses on the history of medicine, women's history, and the history of experiment. She is an accomplished author who has published several works, including a new book this year titled The Poison Trials: Wonder Drugs, Experiment, and the Battle for Authority in Renaissance Science. Her newest project examines witchcraft and medicine in early modern Europe. So without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Rachel Christ, Marilynne K. Roach, and Alicia Rankin.
Thank you so much, Nithya, for that lovely introduction. And I also want to join Nithya in welcoming our 2 speakers today, Rachel and Marilynne. So I'm going to ask them some questions in the first part of this webinar, get some conversation going, and then towards the end, we'll bring in some audience questions. So if you do have questions, put them in the chat and they'll feed them to me and I will ask them at the end of this session. So just to get things going, Marilynne and Rachel, I wanted to sort of ask a pretty general question. The Salem Witch Trials is one of these events in American history that has really captivated both historians and the public alike. How did you each decide to dedicate your own work to this area of studies? And what has surprised you the most in your work as public historians in this area? Maybe Marilynne, if you want to get started, and then Rachel can continue.
Well, it was one of those subjects that I kept coming back to because it's interesting. And eventually I had gotten into so much research on it that I had to keep going forward, or the previous 10 years would have been entirely wasted. But it's constantly fascinating. I found out, obviously, they're not just stereotypes. They're actual people, actual individuals. And once you get to know them, it's like someone you've almost met, if you're interpreting the evidence correctly. But, they were real, and the story is gripping, and there's a good story to it. I want to know more about it. And new information kept turning up. It grabbed me.
Yeah, the stories are, and any historical topic, the historic stories are really what are so gripping. Rachel, what do you think?
So I came to the history of witchcraft in the way that I think is quite common in that it was completely by accident. So I was an undergraduate student at Clark University, and I was really interested in gender history, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with that and how I wanted to focus it. And I was applying to jobs in the museum field, and I really just applied to as many museums in Massachusetts as I could find, and ended up at the Salem Witch Museum, again, kind of completely by accident. I didn't know anything about the history of witchcraft. I didn't know anything about Salem. And I just fell in love with the city and with the history. It's one of those topics, as Marilynne says, is once you're in it, you just can't leave. It becomes so interesting, and you become so invested in understanding these people and their lives. We all kind of have our own, it seems inappropriate to call them fan theories, but we have these kind of elaborate webs that we're talking about all the time. And we at the museum really get to dive into the different people and their roles and their connections to one another. And that you can spend your entire career doing, as Marilynne has proven, and never be finished. So it's really interesting. And also, even more so working in Salem, you kind of have this weird situation where the word witch means something completely different to every person. There's this huge continuum upon which Salem is this little blip. And we see that every day. So working in public history in Salem is kind of this insanely unique case study that is just endlessly interesting. And I think we'll spend many years to come studying.
Yeah, on that exact point, I had a question about Salem in particular, because Salem is globally known as this witch city, and we were just talking before the webinar got started about how crazy Salem gets in October. It's sort of flooded with people interested in witches and witchcraft of all varieties and dressed in Halloween costumes. But if we kind of think historically about the Salem Witch Trials, in many ways it can be an extension of the witch craze that spread throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And actually many of the events of the Salem Witch Trials didn't take place in Salem town itself. So why do you think that Salem itself has earned this name of Witch City? And why do you think it is such a popular destination for people around the world interested in witchcraft and witches? Rachel, why don't you get us started on this one?
Well, in terms of why Salem has kind of become the landing point. So, many of those who were involved in the trials didn't live in Salem. Many of the events didn't take place in Salem, but kind of the big events do. The trials themselves take place in Salem town, modern day Salem. The executions take place in Salem. So the term Salem becoming, associated with them, and I don't know if Marilynne will agree, is basically because, the court was here, Salem Witch Trials. Why we continue to kind of see Salem as the witch city is kind of a more complicated answer. It has a lot to do with the economy of Salem, interestingly enough. In the early 20th century, there's a great fire that burns down a significant portion of the factories in Salem. In fact, Salem had been a industrial city that's kind of the sole, production means for the city. And this fire really destroys, half the factories. So there's this economic depression and lull. Meanwhile, you start to see the word witch appearing a little bit more in pop culture. You get to the 50s with Arthur Miller's play. You get to the 70s and Bewitched does a Salem saga where they come and film in Salem. So you see the pop culture interest in the witch kind of combining with Salem's need to attract more people. And people are starting to show up in Salem wanting to learn more about the history. And that's really where the tourism industry comes from, is feeding into that, desire to learn more about this subject. And it's been Witch City ever since. And who knew it would get this popular? The word witch just continues and continues to grow and is now completely out of control, but in a good way, I think.
Marilynne, from your perspective as an author, I'm curious to hear what you think about this.
Well, it turns out that there were tourists turning up before there was tourism, actually. I think the railroads helped with that, because in 1892, when it was the 200th anniversary, according to a newspaper article that was syndicated nationally, people would come to town and they'd get off the train and want to know. There were two things they asked the cab driver, and this was a horse-drawn cab at this point. Where was Nathaniel Hawthorne born, because they'd read his books, and where were the witches buried? And actually nobody knew that, but they wanted to know about witches. And people would knock on the doors of old houses that were from the period, even though they had vastly changed with architectural changes since they were new, and asked if they could see it. The former Jonathan Cohen's house, he was one of the judges, and it looked nothing like it as it had when it was being used in 1692, and was a storefront added to it, but people knocked on the door and they wanted to see it. So the owner would give tours, and people would knock on the door of what became the House of Seven Gables, because it is a first period house, and ask if they could see it. And that became a tourist aimed spot in order to raise money for current projects of the settlement movement, as well as to preserve the old house. So the tourists' interest was already there. And in 1892, when they were coming and wanting to see these things, there were many in town who didn't want this publicized. They didn't want a ceremony for the commemoration, but because, it really made them look bad, or their ancestors look bad. But that was also the same year that the jeweler in town, Lowe, issued a silver witch souvenir spoon. It was one of the very first souvenir items going in the country, with this little witch on top with a broom and so forth. So all of these forces kind of happened and kept morphing, and the economy was a big factor in that being a big part of current day Salem.
It's so interesting to hear how the tourism and the history sort of mingle together, and the history of tourism. It's such a fascinating story, because I think in Europe, they sort of try to, they're very embarrassed about the witch craze and try to not hype it up. So it's just I think it's a really interesting story of the history of Salem as a city in general. But I wanted to shift to talk a little bit about the place of Salem in current education, because I know both of you are educators, or you have a role in education. And in school, I know many of us have heard and probably still hear a variety of explanations for the Salem Witch Trials. Conservative Puritan society looking to oppress individuals they saw as a threat, or maybe ergotism, or maybe a real belief in the devil that they're on the move in Salem. So from your perspective of being involved in working with young people, Marilynne, for your role as writing books, and Rachel, for your role in education at the museum, do you think we should change the narrative of how we talk about Salem in schools? And how do you try to portray the witch trials in your works reached at younger people? Marilynne, do you want to start with this one?
Well, I don't quite know what they're saying in schools now, but what I did for a children's book that was on the subject, I just tried to do it factual, to make it as accurate as possible. And there's a lot of, there's a million stereotypes and a lot of misinformation and a lot of urban legends out there, but just trying to get the facts. And no, I don't think it was ergotism. The theory that will not die.
Yes, exactly.
But Rachel has more direct contact with the public.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation about the Salem Witch Trials. And I think a lot of that is to do with Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, because I do a lot of work with students around the country. And in my experience, the vast majority of them are learning about the Salem Witch Trials because they're reading The Crucible, or, vice versa. That is where it's incorporated into curriculum. Oftentimes they're English classes, they're not history classes. And the teachers don't really know the fact from the fiction. They're kind of figuring it out, or they know kind of the bare minimum. And we were actually talking about this just the other day, because Arthur Miller is wonderful in that he really made so many people more aware of at least some of the general facts about the Salem Witch Trials. But Arthur Miller also was writing a fictional play, and he's very open about that. He says it in interviews in the 50s after the play has come out. Immediately he doesn't really know what he made up and what's real, and it's not intended to be accurate. So if you really go through and look at the facts of the Crucible, it's almost entirely fiction. He's made up names, he's made up sequences of events, he's made up endings for characters. It's all kind of very a mishmash of details. But most people, that's really their only exposure to the Salem Witch Trials. Now we also have seen, again, with this kind of surge in interest in witchcraft, there's kind of an increase in documentaries and podcasts and things like that. But with those sources, again, you see a lot of misinformation kind of muddled in and purported as fact. You hear the ergot theory constantly, even though it's almost unanimously been debunked by historians. It still lingers on. And you'll hear kind of crazy facts in these documentaries and podcasts and things like that. The things that people have told me about the Salem Witch Trials with really, a sure tone that they knew more, and they were certain that the witches were burned here. And it doesn't, people will argue with us about it because they're that sure. So, I think that step one would be teaching the Salem Witch Trials as part of a historical curriculum. The fact that this is not taught in American history classes is really shocking, because this is a really important event in early American history. You can argue, and I did, that it really, in some ways, affects the American Revolution. But this is not the dominant narrative for the Salem Witch Trials yet. And we'll see what happens. With the pop culture interest comes this kind of surge of misinformation, and unfortunately they kind of go hand in hand. So it's going to take a refocusing in Common Core, I think, to really start to shift the narrative into what's important.
And when you're asked, or when you hear these wild theories, especially the ergotism theory, how do you counter that? How do you portray the causes of, how do you try to portray the causes of Salem in your own work? Or what do you say when you're asked that question? Why did these happen? Rachel, if you want to start, and then Marilynne can pick up.
So especially when talking to students, this can be kind of tricky, because there's no one reason why the Salem Witch Trials happen. I think Emerson Baker, who's a professor at Salem State, and he wrote Storm of Witchcraft, which is a phenomenal book about the witch trials. I think he really said it best in that it's this perfect storm. There's a lot of things happening at the exact same time that allow the Salem Witch Trials to happen. My kind of big focus is the charter being revoked. I think that because the charter is revoked and they're in this weird legal limbo leading up to
Rachel, sorry, just to break in. Do you want to step back and explain to people who might not know what that means? What exactly happened there? Yeah.
Right. So basically, Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter is revoked by the king in 1684. They had been getting away with a very unusual charter that allowed them to be very lenient, kind of independent as a colony. It's a commercial charter initially that they kind of had just slid under the radar with. And so by 1684, the king says, all right, Mass Bay Colony, you guys are getting a little too big for your britches over there. we're going to take back the charter and rethink some things, and we'll give it back to you if you're good, basically, if you can prove that you're loyal to the king. And they do eventually get a charter back, but while they're waiting for the charter, they're in this weird legal limbo. They don't quite know what their laws are going to look like. They don't quite know, are they going to be able to elect officials? Who are those officials going to be? Are they going to still own the land that they've owned for a couple generations now, or is it going to be taken back by the king? This is kind of a weird situation that stretches on for almost 10 years. And when they finally get the charter back, they get it in May of 1692, on the ground physically in the colony. They then need to rewrite their laws, which takes even more time. Meanwhile, there has been this mysterious illness breaking out in Salem Village that is diagnosed as witchcraft. And so my kind of view of this is, whatever that illness is, if it's conversion disorder, meaning they have this, these girls are kind of suffering from almost like a psychological break, they're under a lot of stress and they just kind of snap, or they're outright faking, whatever it is, they're sick in some way. That's diagnosed as witchcraft, and that diagnosis gets really out of hand really quickly. And if it had been 10, 15 years beforehand, it might not have been able to get out of control, because England had some pretty strict rules regarding witchcraft accusations. You had to really be able to prove someone was a witch. So Salem spirals out of control because they're operating in a kind of do what you think is best kind of way, make your own rules, figure it out, think about English common law, but you're allowed to make the choices. And that's, in my opinion, what leads to the chaos that ends up being the Salem Witch Trials.
Marilynne, do you want to add anything from your perspective?
Yeah, well, plus the fact that that was a big deal, especially among the legislators. But at the same time, there's a war going on between England and English and French colonies. So there are constant frontier attacks coming down from Canada, the French Canadians, with their Wabanaki allies, raiding the frontier towns. And at this point, there aren't any English settlements further north than Wells, Maine, which is in southern Maine. So Maine and New Hampshire and upstate New York, which is Schenectady, and Albany, keep getting attacked. And some of the people who are involved in the trials one way or another have been driven from their homes by fire and gunfire and the barn burning down, and their relatives either killed or captured. And some of them were marched all the way to Quebec as hostages, and some of them came back. So there's that specter of that happening at any time too, and the occasional smallpox case. That doesn't really become a pandemic at this point, but you never know. And the war and the situation with the charter has done nothing good for the economy, so that's not in good shape. They don't really have enough money in the treasury to support the war effort, and some people are kind of waiting for the charter to come before they send in their taxes, because who are we going to pay it to? So there's many stresses, as well as the neighborhood ones.
Yeah, that's not even thinking about what was happening in Salem Village, which is its own micro tension.
Yes, but it's affected by the outside world.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I love this as getting back to your point, Rachel, about Arthur Miller and what a sort of simplified view he gives us of the trial. All this complexity of American colonial history, political history, indigenous history. There's so much that feeds into it that, again, you don't usually get that story, that level of complexity from the simplified notions we tend to hear. On the topic of education, I wanted to talk about a bill introduced in the Massachusetts state legislature this year, which you may both have heard about, to clear the name of Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who was condemned in 1693, one of the later condemnations in the witch trials. And she was never executed, but she also was never pardoned. And a group of 8th graders were doing research in North Andover, were doing research for a civic life Project in school, and they researched Elizabeth Johnson Jr. and also the steps needed to make sure that she was formally pardoned. So I'm curious to hear what it is about the Salem Witch Trials that compels us even 300 years later to still seek justice for the individuals, and what thoughts do you have on the efforts of these middle schoolers?
Oh, good for them.
Yeah.
I believe the historian Richard Height tipped off the Andover class about it, but because he's based in Rhode Island, his legislators couldn't do anything about it. But yes, he'd written a book on the Andover end of the accusation. But well, she was in a couple of the petitions. Her brother petitioned to clear her name when that part came up, but she was left out of the original exoneration. And she was left out again in 2001 when 5 more people were cleared. There was no one list that listed everybody who had been considered guilty. You had to pick it out of the different documents. And I have to admit, I omitted poor Elizabeth when I was writing earlier. So don't believe everything that's in my book either. But I was fortunate this July to be able to speak via Zoom when the Joint Judiciary Committee considered the bill to exonerate Elizabeth. I just spoke a few words in her favor, but the chair of the proceedings was obviously in favor of it. So we have hopes that it's going to be soon. Rachel?
And Rachel, I don't know if you have any perspective on why there is this drive still to exonerate these individuals.
Yeah, this is something that I think is actually picking up a lot of steam in Europe as well. There's a group who's currently petitioning to get the women and men, but mostly women, accused of witchcraft in Scotland exonerated, and they're making some pretty significant strides, it seems. The government in Scotland is currently considering that petition, and they're trying to get a memorial built in a witch museum, ideally. We've been consulting with them as they go, which has been really kind of fun. So I think that today there's just this, again, fascination with the history of witchcraft, because it's such an odd piece of history. You know, it's this interesting kind of moment to consider the crime of witchcraft, because someone who was accused of witchcraft was accused of flying and having magic powers and being able to, you know, bring down hailstorms and things like that. These things that we know no one was actually capable of doing until we have a scientific breakthrough that tells us, yes, these were really witches. You know, this is a imaginary crime that's levied against innocent people. But as time has gone on, it's kind of grown into this bigger topic in our cultural memory that just continues to change and evolve. So I think that there's this ongoing fascination with the idea of witchcraft in a contemporary sense for many different reasons. You know, part just kind of fascination that this happened to begin with, part interest in what the words, you know, legacy means then and now. And so as we kind of continue to focus more so on the topic, more and more is brought up. You know, the Salem witches, you know, the people accused of witchcraft in Salem are exonerated, but there are so many people across Europe who are accused of witchcraft whose names we don't even know. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues in the years to come. And I would hazard a guess this is not the last, you know, woman accused of witchcraft to be exonerated for witchcraft.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting point that you bring up about how personalized the Salem Witch Trials have become, as opposed to, I mean, there's some famous cases from Europe that have been, you know, published as books and translated into English and are widespread, but yeah, there's just a whole, you know, group of women and men who are just, we don't even know their names yet. So that's an excellent point. And I was wondering if we could go to the point that you mentioned about just witchcraft being something that is so hard for us to wrap our heads around today. You know, how could this really be something people believed? It's easy to really look down on people in the past as being superstitious or ignorant. And I'm wondering about that sense of superiority we have in looking at the witch trials, because in the sense it's sort of not quite understanding it and being fascinated with it, but also from a perspective of like, well, we're above that. So I'm wondering, how can we formulate holistic judgments when looking back on these kinds of events that are just so hard for us to understand, and how to like engage with these historical events with a sense of humility? Marilynne, I don't know if you want to field that.
Oh, well, yeah, there's a lot of condescension.
Yeah.
I don't think people have, I don't know, this is a general comment, but a lot of people don't seem to have an idea of how things were in any era of the past. History isn't really the top topic in a lot of lives, but so they look down on people who don't have our technology. They were stupid then. They didn't have electricity, so they had to watch TV by candlelight type of thing. But and if the culture is different, which it certainly is, then it's even harder to understand. But they weren't as stupid as they sound. The context of the time, to my assumption, it was more reasonable then to wonder if it might be magical, malefic, witches, or whatever, as opposed to now, when people should have learned a few lessons from that and other things in the past. And there doesn't seem to be any huge outbreak in insanity from time to time, but one keeps hoping. But they were actual individuals. And even then, there was reasoning from the ministers. They would say, magic is impossible for mortal humans to do. They didn't doubt that there were effects, however, which could be coincidences. But if those things happened, then the humans weren't doing it, but some evil spirit was, even if the human didn't know that. So, but then there was the big question: do you have to give permission to the evil spirits, the demons, or can it just happen because they're trying to make trouble for you as well as your supposed victim? And that was one of the problems in the Salem trials. How do you know this person is actually doing the magic, or at least complicit in it? And if they had really followed their own rules in that you cannot trust spectral evidence, then no one would have been convicted. But the confusions of the times and whatever the symptoms were in court were just so alarming that people sort of ignored all that. The court did ignore all that and came to erroneous conclusions that proved deadly.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we kind of don't think about the Salem witch trials being as close to the American Revolution as it is. We kind of think of those as completely separate events. Salem witch trials are these dumb, irrational Puritans with pitchforks running around the streets accusing each other of witchcraft. It's kind of, I would say, the general perception of that event. And then we've got the American Revolution, Enlightenment, reason, democracy being founded, completely separate. But those are very closely linked events. Benjamin Franklin's aunt was an accuser in the Salem witch trials. It's really just one or two generations away. Cotton Mather is alive, relatively close to the American Revolution. I don't know off the top of my head when he dies. Do you know, Marilynne?
1727 or 9.
Yeah.
But he knew Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's one of those things where, again, it just gets oversimplified in our kind of social memory because it sounds so ridiculous to us today. Accusing someone of witchcraft, how could you be so ignorant, is kind of the mentality. But we have to look at it in terms of what is a witch then? Why were people accused of witchcraft? What is the logic behind it? Because there was logic. So it's learning to almost empathize with people of the past, I think, is kind of the missing link here. Remembering these are real people who have families and love one another and, you know, didn't want to kill anyone. They're not just inherently barbaric. You know, they didn't want to murder their neighbors. This was something that happened for many reasons. You know, there's this kind of chain reaction of events that lead to it. And, you know, it happens today too. The kind of behavior involved in the Salem Witch Trials is unfortunately something we see today. We just use different words. You know, it's the same kind of actions, the same kind of formula. So it's one of those things that I think is really hard for us to understand today. And it again speaks to this kind of lack of interest in history, but it's another reminder as to why it's so important we continue to study history.
Yeah,
And the
I
stories
always,
are interesting.
yeah, yeah, and actually that's something I really wanted to ask both of you because part of what you both do is telling stories and telling stories that generally don't get told. So I was wondering if you could each give an example of one of your favorite stories from the Salem Witch Trials and, you know, how you sort of really present that to audiences today.
Trying to choose.
Do you need a minute to think? Rachel, do you want?
Oh, yes. I do.
Go ahead, Marilynne. Yep.
Oh, okay. I was surprised to learn that there were people who spoke up and signed petitions in favor of their accused neighbors. There's several of those extant, at least 4 of them. Didn't do any good, but they did stand up and potentially endanger themselves. They weren't, as a matter of fact, they weren't accused. But there were people who were resisting and thinking in a different way, as opposed to their accusing neighbors who were convinced, at least I assume they were convinced for a while, that their families were actually in danger. But the petitions are a plus that don't get mentioned as much.
Yeah, petitions are super interesting in general, absolutely. Rachel, do you have a story that you kind of go back to that really you think is meaningful from this?
I love the stories of, I mean, the end when, as Marilynne, as we've said a couple of times, you know, it's when you really start to zero in on the specific people is when it gets even more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing a lot of work writing bios for each person involved in the trials for descendants. And that's where it really just becomes so fascinating because you see them as real people. So for example, Elizabeth Howe, who's one of the individuals who's executed, she has neighbors who come and speak for her in court. And the things they say about her are really beautiful. You know, you can start to see this isn't, again, just mob justice. You know, there are people who came into court and testified on her behalf. She also has a blind husband who goes to jail in Boston where she was being kept every week to bring her clothes and food. And that in the 17th century is a really big deal. That's a long, pretty taxing journey. But he went accompanied by one of his daughters to support her while she was in jail. And I think that stories like that, it's just a little bit of a glimpse, but it reminds us these are real people. You know, it seems like he really loved her and he, you know, wanted to protect her. And it's kind of this glimpse into their real lives that you get from the trials. So those are the stories that are the most compelling to me, those kind of really glimpses into the real lives that remind us Puritans weren't these soulless monsters who, you know, married at 12 and didn't love each other and only went to church and only wore black. You know, none of that is the real world in which they lived.
Yeah. And on that point, I had a question for you, both about the sort of aftermath of the trial, because of course, for years after the trial, victims and their families pleaded with courts for financial compensation, recognition. The trials were declared unlawful in 1702. There was a bill restoring the rights and good names of the accused and giving them some compensation. But their reputations, you know, still the family still fought for them. So I'm wondering if you could give a sense of, you know, what happened after the trials ended to both the families affected and also in some sense to the accusers themselves. What was the sort of afterlife of the trial?
Some of the people who had been condemned did petition to have their names cleared. Women mostly, Abigail Faulkner. But when she and some of the others were cleared, specifically their cases because of the petition in 1702, the legislature did put into writing that spectral evidence was no longer to be accepted. They'd stopped using it before that, but here it is in writing. You don't use spectral evidence. When their names were cleared when more names were cleared in 1711 by the reversal of attainder, that did say that the court had been absolutely wrong-headed. I'm paraphrasing there. Well, and there's been movements all along since then to clear the rest of the names. And of course, there haven't been any more witch trial cases, just slander suits brought against people who called someone a witch or decided to take matters into their own hands and beat somebody up because they were a witch. Mm-hmm. But the courts were not going to touch it, and it's proven a real incentive not to think that way in court.
Yeah, and there's kind of this sense after the trials come to an end, almost immediately, that something had gone wrong. There's this kind of acknowledgement that spectral evidence maybe shouldn't have been used, but to acknowledge that spectral evidence shouldn't have been used was to say, essentially, we killed 20 people for no reason, you know? So that's not something the court is willing to acknowledge. But there are these moments, there's a public fast held for the witch trials. Anne Putnam Jr., when she's trying to become a member of her church, comes forward and says, you know, the devil made me do it, but I'm sorry for what happened and I want to repent, you know? So there's this kind of movement forward. You see books published like More Wonders of the Invisible World by Robert Califf that are criticizing the trials pretty early on. So again, the Salem witch trials got out of control very quickly. It was very unusual for the time. Witch trials did not usually end, at least in an English colony, with 19 people hanged and a man tortured to death. That was very unusual. So there is a sense something had gone wrong pretty early on, but untangling exactly what that is takes time. And it also takes some of the key players involved dying to really see things moving along, like William Stoughton. It takes his death for some of the reversals of attainder to really start to flood out.
And of course, immediately after the trials, the government is trying to reorganize itself in a way that is acceptable to the locals who are right there to complain, and to England, who could take the charter away again and just give them a royal governor who tells everybody what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to shift into some of those now. And feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So I have a question from Instagram from Naomi, who asks, what was the ratio of men to women persecuted or killed during the trials? And I assume she means witch trials in general, but also you could speak about Salem in particular.
Well, in terms of Salem, 5 men are executed of the 20 total. So, you know, men are executed just at a, typically there's less of them than there are women. In terms of witch trials, generally speaking, we still don't know exactly how many people were executed during the European witch trials. That's an estimate that has changed with time. The estimate I tend to go with is about 45,000. Some argue 60,000, some argue 45,000 to 50. I tend to go with 45,000, and the estimate is about 75% of those who are executed are women.
Excellent, thank you. We have a couple of different people asking between parallels between the Salem Witch Trials and today. So are there any sort of things you see about whether it's media or rumor mills or life in general today, where you think we can either draw lessons or we see parallels between the historical past and today?
Well, rumors, certainly. There was a lot of gossip.
Yeah.
And the rumors that followed some of the suspects for years before they were actually accused. Some people must have been really, really certain of what they said they thought was happening, even when it wasn't. And people today can be absolutely certain of things that are not actually happening.
Yeah, and I would
I
say
watch the news on occasion. Sorry.
I would say the tendency to scapegoat is something that we see then and now very much so. That's something we really emphasize at our museum. We talk about how a witchcraft accusation is almost always scapegoating. It's when something bad has happened around you, illness, the weather changes and you lose all your crops. You know, something bad has happened. Your village is attacked by indigenous tribes. The kind of reaction can be to find something or someone to blame. So in the 17th century, the devil, you're blaming this on the work of the devil's followers, witches. And that's something that Arthur Miller gets right in the Crucible. You know, the Crucible is an allegory for the McCarthy blacklist. So he was seeing that in his own time, and we absolutely continue to see it today. We just did an event in August of this year, July, about Japanese internment and Asian hate, and how that follows that same formula, that same tendency to scapegoat during times of great fear. That's a direct, you can see that same pattern of behavior happening right now. It's something that unfortunately seems to just be human nature that is very hard to get out of our system.
Yeah, and I think that's a point that ties in sort of multiple nodes throughout history that, witchcraft is just one of the ways in which that scapegoating tendency sort of erupts. So Julie asked a question that Stacy Schiff argued in her book, The Witches, that part of what was going on in Salem and elsewhere were gender and class issues. Young women who were servants, often sexually molested, who had little recourse to improve their own lives. Do you both agree with that argument? Do you agree with part of it? What do you think about this argument?
So gender and class are important factors to consider. To pin it all on young girls who want to improve their own lives is kind of a slippery slope. That's kind of almost the Crucible argument, right? It's a young girl who is having an affair with John Proctor. This is kind of a slope we can fall into, especially because so many of the accusers are women. But it's also much more complicated than that. The kind of connection between gender and witchcraft is obviously clear. You see a lot of women involved in both the accusations and as the accusers and the accused. Mary Beth Norton writes about that in her book. What's her name? Carol Carlson also writes about that in her excellent book that focuses more on New England. So I mean, the girls accusing, saying I am hurt by a witch. It could be that some of them are servants, and it's in a way kind of a mobility. They have a voice in a courtroom that they never would have had. But to say that that's why all of them are in that courtroom accusing is that's too much of a jump, in my opinion. There's a lot of reasons why. You have to kind of focus on each individual person. You could say some of them are probably suffering from PTSD. They had seen terrible things during the wars in Maine. Some of them, again, might have been suffering from conversion disorder. Some of them may really have thought the devil had come to Salem and were scared, So it's one of those things that, again, it's a perfect storm. It's a lot of factors that are involved in the afflictions themselves.
Yes, and why did the courts or even their, the men in their families, why did they believe them and not just dismiss them as silly females? There must have been something about it that was a little different, but we don't have that.
Yeah, and you can also argue, or it's interesting to think about, who is the accusation coming from? Is it coming from this 12-year-old girl, or is it coming from her parents? And we're never going to know the answer to that question, but you're seeing these girls, the accusers are accusing people who their families have had longstanding issues with. Not always, but oftentimes, especially the Putnams. They'd been having fights over borders or territory, or whatever, inheritance. And that's what you see playing out during the witch trials. Is it that Ann Putnam Jr. hears her parents talking about these people and thinks, oh, who's evil around me? Probably the people my parents dislike, they're a witch. Is it that her father came to her and said, you need to accuse Rebecca Nurse of witchcraft? Until we find Ann Putnam's diary that says, this is why I accused Rebecca Nurse, we're not going to know. But it's interesting to think about, again, is it coming from the girls themselves? Are they generating these names, or is the adults in their lives, are the adults in their lives more of an important factor than we tend to think?
Again, and when asking who is afflicting a person, it's easy to give leading questions.
Right.
Even assuming the best that it was just leading questions, because there could be any number of reasons, and there was no one reason with all of it.
So I have a related question that you have partially addressed, but I think we can probably drill down even a little more specifically, which is, what is at the heart of people using the accusation of witchcraft against a woman or a man? So why witchcraft specifically as a charge rather than something else?
Well, witchcraft is the kind of thing that you can, it's in a way easy to blame someone for, because again, it's not real. I can have a fight with, my neighbor, and then have something bad happen to me. My child suddenly gets sick, and then what am I going to do? Blame the neighbor. It's again that tendency to scapegoat. And at the time, this is something that made sense. They're being told in church every week that the devil is around and the devil could be anywhere, and look out for the devil's followers. So it's kind of a natural explanation for misfortune at that time. But that doesn't mean every time a misfortune happened to you, you blamed witchcraft. It kind of takes a very specific fear and anger. And again, I think it's one of those things that you reach for when you don't have another explanation. It's this perfect scapegoat in a way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have another question about the sort of ties between then and now, and in particularly I have a question. I was wondering whether there is some takeaway lessons that the Crucible does get out. So despite sort of criticisms of the Crucible, is there something useful we can learn with regard to the dangers of mass hysteria or lack of understanding of medical phenomena, mental health issues, or something, or et cetera? So is this sort of ties between some examples of mass hysteria now and that sort of mass hysteria? Is that something that the Crucible does bring out usefully? And more broadly, do you see some of these ties between then and now in that sense, beyond the scapegoating issue we've already talked about?
Well, I think he gives an excellent feeling of how it would be to be accused of something you know you didn't do. And if you deny it, they won't believe you. If you admit to something you didn't do, then they're all on board. So, and the utter frustration of really not being believed of facts. And well, that was my main takeaway from it.
Yeah, there's a reason we are still reading the Crucible, right? So despite we might have a slightly more cynical view of the Crucible, just because I deal with the effects of the misinformation in the Crucible all the time, but it's a wonderful work of literature, and it's as Marilynne said, it does a phenomenal job really getting you into the mind of someone who's been accused of something they didn't do and can't convince anyone around him to take him seriously. And what do you do in that situation? So there's a reason why it's a classic in American literature and why we're still reading it. I just wish he had paid a little more attention to some of the details, but
some of them, yes.
Yeah.
Many
some of the main ones.
However, human nature still seems to
right.
doing the same.
Exactly. So Rachel, your former advisor, James Rice, has a question about whether you can talk a little bit more about how people who lived through the trials remembered 1692 and decades down the road.
Yeah, so this is a topic near and dear to my heart, as this is the research paper I wrote for Professor Rice's class. But essentially, it's very interesting. In the years after the Salem Witch Trials, you see these kind of words we're still using today kind of immediately glommed on. Hysteria, calling the girls, kind of saying this is just young girls who are, being crazy. These are the criticisms you start to see early on. What I think is very interesting is the way that the Salem Witch Trials are used as a social criticism in just, like 20, 30 years after the witch trials. So when there's a smallpox epidemic in Boston, and Cotton Mather, who had been involved in the witch trials, though not as involved as he is often portrayed. He's kind of very tangentially there. Cotton Mather is the first to suggest perhaps we start using this crazy idea called a vaccine. It's not called a vaccine yet, but he's basically the first to argue for inoculation, which is a radical medical procedure that he and doctor start performing in Boston, and there's this uproar about it, and it starts to work. It really saves the lives of many, many people living in Boston during that epidemic. But the rhetoric that's being used to criticize Cotton Mather is very much based in the Salem Witch Trials. It's saying, you're a crazy, superstitious, guy. You believed in, the witch trials back then. We shouldn't believe anything you have to say, is kind of essentially the rhetoric being used against him. And I think that that's really fascinating, and that doesn't go away. It stays, that kind of language is used to criticize, as the decades kind of tick along. So, we can't get too mad at ourselves these days for saying those crazy hysterical Puritans, because that's the rhetoric that is being used kind of all along to criticize the Salem Witch Trials.
Yeah, great. Well, we only have time for one more question, and a really quick one. So this will be a quick answer from both of you. But a listener is wondering what compensation was provided to those who were exonerated from the trials. What did they receive in compensation for their problems?
People petitioned for expenses incurred, or their survivors did, for those who have been hanged. And there are itemized bills in the archives. So it depended from one to another. Philip English, the richest man in Salem, had this huge list of over 1,000 plus pounds worth of his merchandise that had been taken out of warehouses, and this poor widow who had barely escaped being hanged, it was her bed and a pig and a couple of small things. So they didn't give him all that he asked for, but it depended on what was asked for. And in some of the people, the surviving spouse, would say X amount we expended coming and going, and court fees and jail fees, but yeah, it would be worth it just to have her name cleared. Primarily that.
Rachel, do you have like a 30-second anything you wanted to add to that in like 30 seconds?
I think that, Marilynne got the key points there. Yeah, sometimes financial, but for the most part, it seems like people were really interested in just clearing the memory of their loved one. Yeah. And that's what we see today still. That's why we're still exonerating people. It's all about finally acknowledging this person is innocent and has been the whole time.
Yeah, and for families that was so important. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's hope for Elizabeth Johnson Jr.
Yes. Let's hope. That's a nice way to end it. We'll hope that goes through, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This was really wonderful. There are great questions from the audience. Thank you, Rachel and Marilynne. It was so informative. And I was really happy that we had so many joining us in the audience. So please follow Tisch College on Instagram for more updates. And that concludes the Civic Life Lunch.